guess for me, ever since the George Floyd uprisings last year and the movements for defunding the police and the movements around abolition, the abolition of prisons, there's always been this kind of back conversation around the Black radical tradition, right? And what's like, what is revolutionary Black culture and what is a Black radical tradition? And I think that, people kind of take that term for granted. They think that, the Black radical tradition is a bunch of things. Some people think that the Black radical tradition is, um, you know, um, things that are produced by Black people that are radical, and that maybe have something to do with the past. And some people think that, and in that case, they think that, any type of artwork or things that are produced by Black people that are shocking or radical, and therefore there's a part of tradition. And I think we have to problematize that term Black radical tradition, right? And really kind of get to the heart of what does it mean to be Black, what does it mean to be radical, and what is meant by tradition. And I think that for me, the first thing for myself is that when I think about what does it mean to be Black, I think that it's two things. I think obviously it's it's the calling out of a grouping of people based on common historical experiences of racialized oppression in this country, right? And so so what that means in America specifically is that those people who Curtis Mayfield called darker than blue, right? And our particular experiences being enslaved, being oppressed, but also our resistance to that. Um, what happened in terms of America in this particular country, obviously, is something that our, our, our background in terms of being separated from the mainstream of America, being separated from the institutions of America, allowed us to form our own cultural formations, with a common language, common geography, and common culture, right? And so, and then if you extend beyond that, um, there's also the Blackness that Black is also beyond that. Black is also incorporating the other experiences of other people because we're part of a broader diaspora, right? And so when we're talking about Black tradition, is also a tradition that's internationalist, right? So when we're thinking about, for example, in a place like New York City, where I'm operating from, the last census says that there was close to 2 million Black people in New York City. Of that 2 million Black people, 40% come from outside the United States, right? Mostly from the Caribbean, mostly from Africa, mostly some of them from Latin America. So the Black, so the Black tradition in that sense is much broader than just the United States. It's an international tradition, and it shows in our movement of people like Marcus Garvey, who came from Jamaica, cultural performers like Harry Belafonte, who we also forget that Harry Belafonte was the first artist to have a platinum album, the Banana Boat song. And of course, we always like erase his Jamaican background, but the song goes Dayo, daylight come out, me want to go home. So he comes from a Caribbean tradition as well. So Blackness is very expansive, it's very broad, it's a very diasporic. And then the other part of it too is also radical, right? Um, by radical, I think that we have to talk about radical in the context of anti-capitalist practices, right? To be very blunt, in practices that really undermine U.S. imperialist hegemony, in practices that really undermine the exploitation of our people. So, our background in terms of labor, we've always been responsible for labor, and so the radical tradition has always been one of Black folks organizing. Um, you know, um, and we've organized in many different ways, in many different expressions, from Black nationalist formations to trade unions to Communist Party to student organizations to cooperatives. Like, when we organize, we're building collective power to undo our exploitation. And the last part, which I think is really interesting too, that's also like a misnomer in a lot of ways in this is a lot of tension, is tradition, right? And I think a lot of times people like say that they're part of the Black radical tradition, but then they don't really like think about like what is the contradiction between radical and tradition? Because if you're radical, you're usually against tradition, right? You're usually someone who's pushing against what is called tradition, what's tradition. But I think tradition in this sense talks about lineage, and it talks about historical genealogy, and I think it talks about the development of a set of practices that have been passed on from generation to generation, and ideas that have been passed on from generation to generation. And I think that the part around the ideas is very interesting for me as someone who does a lot of research in terms of, Black history. We think generationally, right? And I know we're going to get into a rich conversation around Richard Wright and Cedric Robinson and implications of from his work, and also the implication of film. Richard Wright's work occurs, primarily in 1930s, 1940s. He's part of that first tradition of Black intellectuals who were developed, post-slavery. He's in the shadow of what Booker T. Washington called the New Negro movement. And in that New Negro movement, you saw the development of the Harlem Renaissance. You saw the development of like, people like, Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, who were very much influenced by the ideas at the time, including the Russian Revolution. But also that was the first generation that developed the blues. That was the first generation that developed jazz music. That's the first generation that recommitted themselves to recreating Black communal life in the cities when Black folks were going from the South into the North, right? And within that context, they were buttressed by the technology of their time, right? The development of Black life and Black urban life and the Black radical tradition occurs alongside the phonograph and the record. It occurs alongside the development of film. It occurs alongside, like I mentioned, the jazz and blues. And so the technological impact of what we consider Black is part of is also connected to technology, right? And a particular type of archiving that exists as well. I tell people all the time that it's very easy for us today to say like to go to Barnes and Nobles and say we want to go to a Black section of Barnes and Nobles or African American section. In the 1920s and 1930s, you weren't able to do that. You know what I'm saying? People had to create those archives. They had to create those records, those archives, those things. So the technology at the time is just as important. And I think that, the technology at the time is also important now. You have a Black Lives Matter movement that this generation is the first generation to be raised primarily under a Black president. This is the second generation outside of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. And the technology of the time, doing a remix is hip hop. It's again the record, right? It's hip hop, but it's also the hashtag. And so that to the records and the hashtag in particular serves as this universal umbrella to have this conversation around Black culture, right? And that technology part around Black culture is just as important. The last thing I would say though is that we're at a time right now where we're seeing lots and lots of Black cultural production, or at least I would argue Black representation and not necessarily Black cultural production. And I can explain that a little bit more later. The question for me is that, a lot of this speaks to, I think, some of the problems of Black life that we face today, and some of the Black problems that facing Black culture. And I just want to kind of indicate three, and then maybe talk a little bit about solutions. One is that, we still have the problem of surveillance and police brutality, in the role of violence in the state, particularly against Black cultural figures, but against the Black cultural community as a whole. Two, the problem of gentrification. you know, the art of being creative is dependent upon, having a Black community to be creative in. And, Eric is going to be speaking soon. And you can talk about, the wonderful creations that came out of Los Angeles in the 1950s and 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, that came out of a Pacific Black community. I come from Harlem, and and that's needless to say that was considered the cultural capital of Black America. But the gentrification is taking a toll within that. It's also the question around monopoly and the monopolization of culture, and who gets to be considered creative. We have a situation in America right now where we have a creative class, so to speak. And oftentimes Black people aren't seen as part of the creative class, even though we're the drivers of creative culture, at least in terms of television and radio and things of that nature. But, the tools that we need to actually create the culture often not times are not in our hands. And it's part of a broader issue around the role of technology, again, who has access to technology. But also like who has the rights in terms of Black life and Black culture in an increasingly monopolistic situation in the United States. So one of the things that happened a couple of years ago that no one even talks about is that, Universal Records had a major fire in Hollywood. And many of the masters of Black artists like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, The Roots, Bill Withers, they were destroyed in a fire, right? Now, no one says anything about it because they say, well, you just have a copy. But imagine if there was a fire at the Louvre, right? And remember the fire that happened in Notre Dame and how tragic people felt and how they felt so hurt that Notre Dame was caught on fire and burned down. And people all over the world gave billions of dollars to rebuild Notre Dame. Well, this is a fire of American culture that happened, and no one blinked an eye. You know what I'm saying? But the bigger issue is that why did Universal have so much Black music in their catalog and in one place? Is because Universal was able to buy up all these catalogs from all these independent Black labels and have a control of the music share